Hi, thank you for listening to the lecture. This is Chapter 1, which is simply an introduction to social psychology. We'll look at what it is, how research is done in it, and a few other things, a few ideas of social psychology. So, what is social psychology? Well, first, let's define what psychology is. Psychology is simply the science of the mind and our behavior. Mind includes the way we think and feel. So it's simply studying the way we think, feel, and behave. So what's social psychology? It's a selective part of psychology which studies how people think about, influence, and relate to one another. So it specifically looks at the social aspect of behavior and thinking and feeling. How is that affected by each other and how we relate to one another? Some major ideas in social psychology are that we construct our social reality. In other words, we want to attribute behavior to a cause and therefore make it seem orderly, predictable, and controllable. In other words, we don't like chaos. Usually, as humans, we feel negative about chaos. We want to have things under control and things to be predictable. And that's one idea in social psychology. We want things to be predictable and orderly. So we seek out ways to do that. Another idea is that our social intuitions are often very powerful, but sometimes perilous. In other words, sometimes they're wrong. So let's define intuition. Intuition is the innate ability to know something without having to consciously think about it. We most commonly call it a gut feeling, or I knew this would happen, or I just had an idea about this, a gut feeling. And as it mentions, that can be powerful. We often listen to that gut feeling and it can have a great influence on our behavior. However, again, it can be perilous because we can be wrong. And having that gut feeling can prevent us from thinking critically about a situation. We just go with the gut feeling instead of really thinking about the consequences of the situation. Another idea in social psychology is social influences shape our behavior. We all know that we're social creatures. None of us wants to live alone on an island. We long to connect, to belong, and be well thought of. So society influences our behavior. Other people influence our behavior. Personal attitudes and dispositions also shape our behavior. So we know that our own attitude and personality influences the way we act. The way we think, the way we feel, obviously is connected to our behavior and influences the way we act. We also know that social behavior is biologically rooted, genetic, in other words. Our behavior is influenced both by our environment, which is often called nurture, and genetics, which is often referred to as nature. Social psychology's principles are applicable in everyday life. They help us understand our thoughts, feelings, and behavior, which again is the core of psychology. And another core of psychology is the diagram. Our thoughts and feelings and behavior are all intertwined. One affects the other. And that's the main idea, again, behind psychology, is that our thoughts and feelings and behavior, they're all connected, but it looks at how do they affect each other. Let's look at hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is also called the I knew it all along phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon that allows people to convince themselves after an event that they accurately predicted it before it happened. And that can lead people to conclude that they can accurately predict other events. For example, someone might say, I knew they would break up when he moved away because out of sight, out of mind. Well, looking back after they break up, I think, oh, I knew that. I was able to predict that. We know that's really not true. You weren't able to predict the event, but it makes us feel like we can predict other events. In other words, it gives us that control and orderliness that we're looking for. Let's look at how research is done in social psychology. We know that the research is done usually on the way we think, feel, and behave in relation to others. But how do you do that research? How do you come up with those ideas? A theory is an integrated set of principles that explain and predict observed events. In other words, a theory might ask, why do we think the way we think? Why do we feel the way we feel? Why do we behave the way we behave? A theory wants to answer those questions. And so when doing research, a psychologist will come up with a theory, which is your hypothesis, which is a prediction that when tested can lead to the confirmation or non-confirmation of a theory. So once you've come up with a theory, your hypothesis, I think this will cause this, how do you test that hypothesis? Researchers must choose a sample of people. They must decide who will be in the study. A random sample indicates that everyone in the population has an equal chance of being included in the study. Well, that's really not possible because we can't take everyone in the population and pull different types of people from that population. That's really not possible. A sample size indicates the number of people that will be in the study. More people equals more accurate results because you've got more types of people, you have more ideas and more accurate results. Researchers must ask questions that are without bias, which is also almost impossible. They must ask questions without bias, therefore do not influence the respondents' answers. We know we all have bias. We all have biases that we're not even aware of. And we all know that everything we do affects each other. So it's impossible for a researcher to ask a question that isn't going to influence the respondents' answers. But they do the best they can. Two types of research are correlational and experimental. Correlational research focuses on the relationship between two variables. For example, do children with higher IQs have better school performance? The disadvantage of this type of research is although we might find out there is a relationship between IQ and school performance, we don't know which comes first. We don't know causation. In other words, does a higher IQ lead to better school performance? Or does doing well in school lead to testing higher on an IQ test? We know they're related, but we don't know which causes the other. Unlike correlational research, experimental research wants to determine more than if there's a relationship. It wants to determine cause and effect, which variable causes which one. So how's that achieved? To answer this question, let's look at the example offered by the textbook, which this theory / hypothesis is, does watching violent TV videos increase violence and aggression in children? Well, the theory is that watching violent TV videos will increase the likelihood of aggression in children. This is the theory and the hypothesis these researchers started with. So the experiment participants are randomly assigned to two different groups. A control group, which is not exposed to the independent variable, so they're not exposed to violent TV and videos. And an experimental group, which is exposed to the independent variable, so they are exposed to violent TV and videos. The independent variable is the cause. And this dependent variable in this study is the effect, or the child's level of aggression after watching the violent TV videos. So in other words, they're looking at, does this control group who's not exposed to the videos, their hypothesis is that their level of aggression will be lower than the group of participants who are exposed to violent TV and videos. So how do you get to a conclusion? Well, if your hypothesis is correct, there is proof offered to it if children who were exposed to violent TV videos then exhibit significantly more aggression than those who were not exposed. That was the hypothesis, that they would exhibit more aggression, and so if that is the case after doing the experiment, then there is proof offered to your hypothesis. It may be correct. Replication. It's important that when a researcher conducts a study that it's repeated, because replication further confirms that your hypothesis is correct. You know, if several different studies get the same results, that kind of further offers proof of your theory. Once a lot of studies have been done on a certain topic, then a researcher can actually do a study of those studies, which is called a meta-analysis. And the idea behind a meta-analysis is to get a clearer picture of what they collectively indicate. There's 10 studies done on the effect of violent TV and videos on aggression. So a meta-analysis would consist of looking at all 10 studies. What do they all collectively indicate? That's the end of the lecture. Those are just some basic ideas that are in the chapter. If you have any questions about anything discussed, please let me know.